Who's that handsome guy?
Have you got a mirror?
Ah,
Yeah, yeah. Actually, Craig's quite a good-looking guy. I've just see that now.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. That's,
Yeah.
Gareth and I always discuss this, and it's tough being the good-looking one.
Yeah, it's one of the problems I've had my entire life.
Oh, really? Yeah, I can
Yeah.
see, man. Yeah, and so you and I will have a chat after this. We'll discuss how tough it is, and
Yeah,
Garrett's.
it's not. Yeah, well, you always have to have an ugly duckling somewhere along the line.
Yeah, we're the ones that are good to like initiate conversation. You know what I mean? We're not scared to go and chat to other people because we're so ugly. We need to use these
Right.
other things.
Why? I don't like people. That's why I became a teacher.
People just feel sorry for each other. That's what they're like. Well, we should just go and entertain the guy,
Yeah,
make
no.
him feel.
But
Whatever
that's
works
a
for
nice shirt, bud. When did you get that?
Oh, I bought it for the interview.
Ah, cool.
I was in PE, and then I lived. Do you know the Woolies there? There's a Woolies and a Cantaloupe Alley or something was just up the road there.
Yeah,
Um,
I owned the Something Fishy there when we opened in.
Are you serious?
2000.
Yes,
Yeah.
I used to be a patron there fairly regularly when I was a student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a drive-through. It was one of the first drive-through Something Fishies.
Yeah, oh really? I didn't know. I knew that. I didn't know it was one of the first ones. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was cool, man. Like, how did you like? Because it was good for me. Like, there was even stories there that I was like, oh, cool. I never knew. And you know what? But I didn't even know your dad's name. It's so weird. Like,
Really?
I don't think.
Well, it's always Mr. Fuchs to you.
No, of course. But I'd never ever heard you say his name. It's so strange.
it's
Or I
true.
probably
Yeah.
have, but I might have forgotten. You know.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
You're right.
What's your
But
mom's
Sean,
name?
I was going to say,
Naomi.
what's-
No, see, I don't even, it's so weird. I've never ever thought to ask that.
Yeah.
It's crazy, man.
Yeah. Okay.
that was a really great chat. Thank you so much. Like, honestly, there was like, we could have gone on for another hour. I wanted to ask you about
Yeah.
your dad's stories in the war. Like, there's so much interesting stuff. But thank you. Really, 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 really appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
I think, once again, these kind of chats are really valuable to, at this stage, a handful of people. But you know what? It's like your whole journey with what you've done already, you still touch someone along that journey. You don't always know who, but someone hears that and goes, shit, I'm going to do something. And I think, so I think that story was really, really great. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. I think for me, you're not going to change the world, but you can change the world one student at a time.
Totally.
And that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ooh.
Great, sorry, my man. Happy Saturday, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, man. Are you having fun today?
Yes, bud. Absolutely, man. Always having as much fun as possible. And yeah, we had a great chat today with a good friend of mine, Shaun Fuchs. And what an awesome chat it was. And one of the themes in the chat was just about having fun, do you know what I mean? And enjoying yourself. And it came to a lot of different things in the chat when we were talking about your career and, you know, exercising and having a side job or a side hustle, and how for him, by always having fun was kind of a key indicator for if it was like still the right thing to do or to carry on with. And I think that's so important, you know what I mean? In life, we make it so complicated, but it's actually the simple things in life which we kind of really do just need to sometimes focus on more, you know, and having fun is one of those things. It's so important just in terms of our overall health as well. So yeah, what did you think, Craig?
Yeah, man, I think having some kind of barometer of your life in different aspects is so important. And why not keep it simple, like you said? And like Shaun says, you know, it doesn't always have to be super complicated. And that being said, it's not always necessarily easy, because you have to make difficult decisions sometimes in terms of, wow, I'm actually not having that much fun if I really look at my life honestly. And then you probably have to make some decisions that might not necessarily be easy. But once again, it is actually fairly easy if you decide to live your life like that. Because if something's not fun, move on or make it fun. Change something that you're doing. And, along with those kind of ideas, Shaun is seriously super inspiring in terms of the way he communicates and the way he educates. Education is his thing, and he's super passionate about it. And you just can't help being super excited and inspired by listening to how thoughtful and how much effort he used to put into when he was a teacher. And that sort of trend has persisted in his life, and he continues to be helping youngsters and people of all ages actually now just be better versions for the future. And who knows where that education ends up, hey Gareth?
Absolutely. And one of the important things that I took away is that if you are a teacher of some sorts, and all of us are going to be a teacher in our life at some point, right? And that teacher could be your normal term of a teacher, someone who teaches kids in a classroom. But then all of us at some point, we're probably going to be parents, or we're probably going to be good friends and role models for people. And you are a teacher and an educator in that way. And therefore, you have a responsibility. And it's so important to recognize that responsibility and realize that you can positively change and influence a person's life through the way that you teach them, through the way that you tell your story. And by giving them the right information, you're going to give them the opportunity to allow them to make their own decisions on something. And I think education is just it's such a beautiful thing, if it's done properly. And we should all realize that we have this responsibility and treat it with the utmost care. What do you think, Craig?
Yeah, I think when you impart honest reason to and education in whatever form it is, like you said, as a parent or whatever, you often don't know the trajectory that person goes on after you've done that. And that trajectory could lead to changes in the community, which leads to changes within the your town or city. And ultimately, you can actually have shifts on the grander scale of a whole country. So I just think you have to come from a place of truth and honesty and consistency as an educator. And I think that Shaun has really, really embodied that 100%. So let's take a moment now and listen to what makes Shaun Fuchs ridiculously human. Good stuff.
Cool stuff. Well, hello. Good morning, Mr. Fuchs, Shaun Fuchs. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. How's your day going, bud?
Yeah, good. Nice sunny morning in Joburg. So all good so far. It was nice and early, actually. Thank you.
You haven't had to deal with some of that beautiful Johannesburg traffic.
Not on Saturday, no.
Makes sense.
And how's your week been? Because obviously we were away together in France celebrating your birthday. Thank you for the brilliant trip. And you just come back this week. How's it been back settling into the new year for you?
Yeah, good. Joburg's, quite slow still. So from Monday, it's chaos. School starts, so nice and busy. Most teachers and that will be back, and kids are back on Wednesday. So from then on, it's back to Joburg traffic and crazy. So this week's actually been beautiful. The traffic has been easy, nice to get to work. So it's eased into it, which has been great.
That's cool, man. And Shaun, the way you start years these days is a little bit differently now. You're working more on the corporate side of things. So do you miss the start of the school year and preparing for it? Because I guess now it's quite a little bit different.
I miss school full stop. That's that's the bottom line. It's not the same, and you miss that excitement and that energy of the kids coming back. And as much as they say we got school and we don't want to be back at school, they love it. They're so excited to see their mates and catch up and everything. And of course nowadays everyone knows exactly what you did because it's being put on social media, so everyone knows, and they've been chatting to each other. But it's still different when they see each other face to face. It's just a great energy, and you miss that. You don't have that all the time.
Yeah, and you're always excited to see who the new people are, and there's always like these little nuances and who the some new people and exciting new maybe like sports that you want to play or new subjects. So it's always like something exciting, definitely, when you get back to school as well.
Yeah, I loved going back to school myself. So for me, it was always important to make sure that experience is the same when kids get back. And so, I mean, you'll remember yourselves, and anyone kind of listening to this will remember the excitement of going back to school, whether it was grade 1 or whether it was in grade 12, matric. You always remember it, and you kind of the start of that year and the milestone. So it's next week's going to be an exciting week, certainly.
Shaun,
there was just one there was one thing that kind of ruined, was a terrible advert and still sticks in my mind. It was, I don't know what the company was, but it was back to school, back to reality. And I was like, I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that. It was back to school, back to reality.
Yeah.
Gareth, you've got to get a bit more D minor there, please.
Oh, sorry, bud.
Too much D major. Yeah,
I was trying to balance it out. But I also think I don't know if it was just me personally or like me and my mates, but I think we were lucky with school because I just had such a good experience at school, so therefore did always look forward to it. And I also think in South Africa, school is more of like an enjoyable experience, say maybe compared to other countries, although I don't really have anything to compare it against, just from what I think. Do you think like we're kind of fortunate with the school setup that we have in South Africa?
Yeah, it depends, and again, it's everyone's experience, isn't it? The experiences that kind of if you went to a school that was a private school that generally or a good sort of government school, even generally like Four Ways High, Bryanston, Northcliffe, the kids do enjoy it. But again, I think it's just completely circumstance and the environment. I mean, you could have schools in rural areas in the poorer areas of South Africa that kids love going to school. I mean, I on many of my trips to sort of the grade camps, and you're out in a lot of those camps are out in the rural areas, and you're driving on the sand roads and you're seeing the kids walking to school. I've never seen the kids unhappy. They're always playing games. They're always excited. So I think it's just it's what people make of it. That's the important part.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
But talking about our school, being excited to see people and, also some teachers and that kind of thing. We're sitting here having a chat with a teacher and a student. Tell us a little bit how we are actually sitting here with the three of us, one being a teacher of the other in the past. So how does that work out?
I guess that's my story, isn't it? So, I mean, I was teaching at Four Ways High School, and that was the first school that I started teaching at. And I can't remember, I think it was in 93, around about 93 or 94.
94.
Gareth arrived as this little grade 8 or standard 6, this little grade 8, and had this massive mop of blonde hair and was really quite a cute kid. You actually liked him. And and started playing water polo, and was a year younger than the others. I remember that well. And so I started coaching him water polo, and then later on, and rugby as well. Since he left school, kept the contact. I think that was one of the most important things for me. Was I always remember going to the International Principals Convention in Canada, in Toronto in 2011, and there was a keynote speaker there, Jennifer James, who's absolutely phenomenal, one of the best speakers I've heard. She's nuts, and she's just completely eccentric, and she's a cultural anthropologist. And her comment to this audience of 2,000 plus headmasters, headmistresses, principals, whatever you want to call us, was the most interesting thing about you is you never get to see your end product.
Yeah.
And I think for me, what I've always tried to do is to see as much of that end product as I can in my students that I've taught through the years.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's really that's a really cool way to give, I guess, the chat some context. So obviously, Mr. Fuchs, Shaun, Sir, and obviously one of my greatest buddies ever. So thank you. You have been such a big influence in my life, and yeah, like you said, we met when I think I was 13 in '94. And ever since that day, like our first water polo session, you've been an integral part of my life, and a huge mentor to me, and I can't thank you more enough for that, but mostly for the friendship, for the advice, and just for being the person you are. It's not just me that you've kind of touched in the way you have. It's many other people, and we will get into that for sure in the conversation, and I think it's really fantastic just the way you've been as a human and the way you've presented yourself personally. So Fuchs, I'm going to call you Fuchs if you don't mind, throughout the chat, the story is obviously about you. This chat is about you, and we like to find out a bit more about your childhood and your upbringing. So can you just take us back to the early years? We know that you grew up in Johannesburg, and you started your life as part of a pretty big family. You've got 3 siblings, obviously 2 fantastic parents as well. And early life for you was, as far as I know, primary school in Boskop. And then let's start there and take it from there.
Okay, thank you. So born and raised in Joburg, always lived in Joburg, and it's interesting because so many past students, friends that I've taught, that I've interacted with, have moved out of Joburg and lived in different parts of the world. Both of you were originally, or at some point, were in Joburg, and now Australia and the UK. So, and there's so many that have done that. But I've been here forever, travelled the entire world, but have always come back to home to Joburg, and I love it. It's just it's growing up in a city that's got a heart and has got an energy, and there are few cities I find that have that same kind of vibe that Joburg does. So it was growing up there, going to with my older brother Gareth, going to primary school at Boskop, which is still around, and those days were very different. Of course, it was the early 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, and South Africa was a different place, wasn't it? It was in apartheid. It was during the 76 Soweto uprisings. It was a very different place that I grew up in. But I loved my childhood. Many days of kind of living on a plot out in Pelindaba or North Riding and playing in the dam, clay lot fights with mud, and sort of riding horses and your bicycle and that. So it was a wonderful place for me to obviously to grow up in. You obviously had that dichotomy of society with the apartheid structure, and it was very different for a lot of other people. But again, I think this is about my experience and what worked for me, and that certainly it was. I had a wonderful childhood. I really did. I started playing rugby at Boskop when I was in grade 1. You had to, and you played barefoot. And winter and early mornings kicking the ball and your foot stinging and running on the sort of the typical Joburg Highveld winter with the frost on the grass. And if I think today how parents kind of treat kids, and I mean, that would never happen. I mean, certainly not in Joburg northern suburbs anymore. So that was my experience, and really loved it. My brother and I used to catch the bus from Boskop down to the Shell garage, and he was 18 months older than me, so a year ahead of me, and he would always be causing problems with someone on the bus. So we'd get to the Shell garage and then have to get off, and there would be a fight, and he would be fighting. I'd have to support him because that's my dad said, you support your brother. But most of the time I would negotiate something out of it. I would negotiate with some sweets or a Rolo or a Tex or a bar one, get us out of the fight. And he couldn't understand that. He was like, how do you get us out of the fight? We're supposed to, cup these oaks or beat them. I was like, oh, we can negotiate our way out of this. So yeah, that really, I suppose, was me growing up.
And Shaun,
some of us have the gift of the gab, and some of us don't really. Hey?
Yeah, and I ended up playing prop, so there wasn't much chance to negotiate in the front row. Trust me. But out of that, definitely, yeah.
And was it obvious to you, like back in the day, the sort of the difference, or what was going on in South Africa? Like. Was it something people spoke about, apartheid, or was it just you got on with your own life and that was something else?
It wasn't spoken about, certainly in growing up. If I recall, the first time I really got to understand that there was this concept of apartheid was in my latter part of my high school career. Because you must remember at that point, the state controlled everything. They controlled media, they controlled television, there was no such thing as social media. I don't think apartheid would have lasted as long as it did if social media was around at that point in time. So they could control a lot of things. And you were fed what they wanted you to feed. It was complete indoctrination, and it was it was propaganda. And so you didn't get to understand that. I think one of the first experiences that I had was later on when I was at university, and we were organizing a sporting excursion with all the other teacher training colleges at that point in time. I remember at that point, that was in the late 80s, and we were trying to organize buses to head off to the Normaal College in Pretoria, which was an Afrikaans college, and the bus drivers refused to transport the black students. So you kind of then got a very clear understanding, well, these are students that are with us, they're with us at varsity or at Wits, and Wits at that point had students of all color, and you couldn't get them on the bus. So we had to eventually get a separate bus to transport them because of the apartheid laws, where you couldn't have people of the same color on the same bus.
Well, Shaun, I would imagine, though, like there was, I guess, a moment where you really took it all in and noticed it. But growing up in a sort of a semi-rural area on the farm and that kind of thing, you obviously had, some black friends, and I would imagine, and you guys would play together, or as children, and obviously then you go to school and it's different, I guess, and but it didn't really dawn on you at the time.
Yeah, it didn't. It's 100% correct, and you'll see that. So when you in education and you're dealing with kids, you'll see in your pre-primary, so your early stages, and right through to your junior primary, grade 1, grade 2, there's no prejudice with the kids. we're not born naturally with prejudice. It's instilled into us. So it comes from the home, it comes from the environment, it's an external factor, and I really believe that. And I see that all the time. And so you did. Many of us grew up and played in the 70s, where we had friends. So some of our staff, their kids would be living on the same property as us, and we'd be playing with them, and we'd be cycling and having fun. And you, of course, you don't even think about that. You just see that as a fellow human being. So that's that statement or that comment is absolutely right.
And do you feel that it's kind of changing now in South Africa?
In terms of
that sort of like relationship between people that are like different colors, we treating each other like we're the same, or is there still undertones to it?
No, I think so. Again, for me, you go back to, so I speak from my own experience.
Yeah.
Wherever I go, and it's not always the case because you do pick up situations like this, but wherever I go, so I go to gym, and from the weight training section to cardio to the change rooms, everyone's there. There are all races there. Every South African is there. No one has an issue. There's no issue there. You go to restaurants, there isn't an issue. And we work environments. In December, so many Christmas parties and that. And you see so many people of color, mixed sort of South African groups, and everyone's just enjoying themselves. The biggest issue that we have is how the media portrays it. So the media is first to portray any form of racism, in particular in this country. So the moment they pick up a racial incident, whether it's an incident that's at the Spur, they will milk it and harp on it continuously because it's newsworthy. And then that becomes almost, this is the benchmark of what South Africa is about. Well, that's not actually the case. There's 45 million of us living here. That's not the case at all. And yes, there are cases in South Africa where there are elements. There's elements all over the world. It's not unique to South African society. It's all over the world. Take the American president as a classic example, And so in our environment, it's fueled by the media and it's fueled by the politicians. I have a great example. I had a really, when I was headmaster, I had a racial incident at the school, and the Sunday Times called to find out about the racial incident. And my question to the journalist was, the incident is a once-off thing. It's an absolute, it's a once-off thing that's happened within the school, and we've dealt with it. And of course, when you're a headmaster or you head up a school, you will deal with things, and you're going to have some people that will like it and some people think you've done a terrible job. And that goes with the territory. But my challenge to the journalist was this: you're focusing on this one incident. Are you aware that the school ran a fantastic outreach program where they're actually building a library in a disadvantaged community? They're bringing the kids, those same kids across. They're teaching them on a Learn to Swim program. They had them in an assembly. They've been really working closely with that community to help uplift those kids. Not interested in that article. The only article they were interested in was the racial incident. So, for me, that is typical of where South African society, sadly, is at the moment in terms of where the media and the politicians go. But I will still argue that in a general sense, certainly in your urban areas, that the vast majority of South Africans respect each other and continue to and go about their normal lives and just try and make a living and try and better themselves.
Yeah, it's so true.
And it's what, like, you will see this as well. Like, when you travel the world, like you kind of you have a picture of places before you visit it because of, say, the news and whatever stories you had. But when you get there, it's often like so different. It's almost like we live in this like world that has like two elements to it. And it's because that the media and whatever, they only ever like want to sell like the bad news or the big stories, whatever. But the actual truth often like doesn't come out until you actually go there and you live there and you know it yourself. And it's kind of sad, I think, that like morally and ethically, these people that work for like the news, they think that those are the right stories to tell the public. But I do think also with social media and stuff, like now the truth is coming out in a way because there are more voices in this world.
Well, it's a simple concept of teaching history. When you teach your students, you say, what do we understand about history, and how do we take from the past? We look at evidence. So we look at primary evidence and we look at secondary evidence. So what is the best form of evidence? It's primary evidence. So you have an experience, you were there at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, so you give me the exact, this is what it was like, this was the crowd, this is what happened. That's primary experience. I then pass that on, and that's the secondary. But my story, having heard it from you and me passing it on to someone else, is probably going to change a little bit. And so what you try and do is I try and find you, I try and find Craig was there, I find someone else was there, I try and find 5 or 6 different people that were there, get their stories, and eventually in between there, you're going to get the truth. And I think that's part of the problem that we don't get to. Certainly in many cases in the media, they will run with one particular source and not do the basics of what they should be doing. And that message gets portrayed to the public. And sadly, people will take what they want and digest what they want and run with what they want. And I think that is an important thing. And that's a basic concept of teaching. In a history class, get as much information and evidence as possible.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's really, really valid. Like, I think it becomes a lot harder for people to impart that kind of knowledge when you can sit at home and you can see one side of a coin really easily because you cherry picking the information that you're choosing to see. So then you look at that information and make decisions on one piece of that story. And I guess it's so easy to get misled. And I think that's definitely part of the problem. And I guess that's where parents and teachers really come into their own, where they're like, okay, when you hear something, how do you dissect that? How do you as an individual do your own history taking, And I guess that's something that you've become good at. And did you sort of pick that up from one of your parents? Let's take a step back and just, what did your parents do, and how did you sort of get this passion for teaching knowledge and history and these kinds of things, Shaun?
So my mom was always involved in sort of doing numbers, so figures and that, and she was involved initially in a banking sector, as working in the banks. In the sort of 60s and late 50s, and then eventually went on to salaries and wages and that. And so I suppose there's always an influence there. And my dad was always doing his own businesses. So he was worked in sort of engineering business and doing high-speed steel saws and cutters and routers but was always an entrepreneur as well. But and then had enough of that in the late 70s and sold all that and bought bought 2 gyms in Joburg City Centre and in Hillbrow, and ran those for a couple of years before he kind of got rid of those and then went back to engineering. And that's what he ultimately retired doing. So I think it was probably a lot of it was probably because it was a big family. I think the influence extended in around the dinner table where there were 4 kids, mom and dad, and we had many debates and arguments and stories, and you had to try and finish your food without a sibling eating it. Normally I was the sibling eating the food. So everyone was trying to, and so I think it's those healthy discussions that you have around the table that create that sense of debate and listening and awareness more than anything else.
And
yeah.
Shaun, I don't think I've ever really asked you, where did your real interest in history actually come from? What was it, just through these debates they're talking about now, or did you say, like, when you were in high school, did you have a teacher who taught you history and you became more interested in it? Like, why is that such a big part of, you and...
I don't think there was any particular influence on that. I think I always had a very natural instinct for enjoying history. So always kind of enjoying old buildings, enjoying kind of reading stories. When I grew up in the 70s, you kind of remember it was really just less than 30 years after the Second World War. So a lot of people who are my age now, even younger, were involved in the war and had fought in the Second World War. So a lot of discussions with adults and meeting people when I was growing up came from that. So that had always been a fascination of mine. My father was involved, my uncle was involved, his brother. So you kind of grew up with that, and I think that probably was a natural influence in the history, And you went to the corner cafe and you bought comics that were World War II comics and stories, and it was very much part of your everyday life. So I think that to me was something that I really enjoyed and picked up. And when I had gone into teaching, it was a natural thing to choose as a major.
And so you were being sort of subconsciously taught by people that have been through a lot, obviously, and had a lot of historical things to discuss with you. So how important do you think it is, Shaun, to sit down and as a family and have discussions? I seem to think that's a really, really powerful way of sort of teaching and also learning to communicate and learning to have discussions. That's quite a central thing, I guess, in your upbringing then. Would you agree?
Sorry, I was just having the modern family discussion.
Touché.
Oh, classic.
It drives me absolutely insane when you go out and you see families having breakfast or wherever, and the kids are given a tablet or a phone right from 3 years old right through to teenagers. They're sitting around the same table. They cannot have a conversation because they're on their phones the whole time. So the art of conversation is to a large extent dying. Younger generation will argue, well, that's not our conversation. Our conversation is actually about social media. Our conversation is about texting someone or WhatsApping someone. And that's a debate I'm sure we'll have in many years to come. And in 30 years' time, in whatever version of podcast is happening, it'll be an interesting thing to see. But, my generation certainly, and to an extent you guys, we still have conversations, and it's one of the things that's not happening. We introducing at one of the schools that I manage, we're introducing a lunch now. And the lunch it's quite standard in the States and in Europe and many UK schools where the kids at school have a lunch. In South Africa, that's a very unique concept. We have a beautiful dining hall, so the thinking was, let's give them a lunch as well. And one of the things that we're pushing from an educational point is to say, no cell phones, no smartphones, nothing. You're going to sit around the table and you're going to have a conversation and you're going to talk and you're going to engage and you're going to engage with the person opposite you. And I will tell you, so the first one is next Wednesday, which I'll go to, and it's going to be interesting to see how that goes down. And I will still argue that the kids will actually enjoy it.
Yeah. Totally, I totally agree. Yes, it's so important to have conversations with people, but it is as well. It's I guess it's difficult to explain to kids because they don't kids now because they don't actually know any different to communicating online or on their phones and stuff. So like I said, it's going to be interesting, Shaun, in the next 30 years to kind of have this chat again and go, oh, you know what, we were actually wrong to make our kids chat on computers and phones and stuff like that. And just to take it back again, obviously school has been, a massive part of you and still is to this day. So you went to JP Boys High, which was always and probably still is to this day one of like the top boys schools in Johannesburg and South Africa. And, it sort of influenced, I guess, a lot of who you are now. So you were first team rugby player, you were a water polo player, you took a lot of interest in other sports too. Can you just tell us a little bit about your high school career and like the leadership roles that you might have had there as well?
Yeah, I loved my high school career, and the school was great. And I think a large part of schools being great is actually about the teachers, and so for me, kind of going into, we'd moved out of Hillbrow, we'd moved into Kensington at that point, and my dad had always wanted my brother and I to go to JP. A mate of his who he knew in the 50s was always in the bar and wore his JP blazer, always the black and white blazer, to the bar. And so my dad kind of, since the 50s, had said, listen, if I have kids one day, boys, they're going to go to JP. So for him, it was a very natural thing for us to go. I actually wanted to go to Parktown Boys, and thank the Lord I didn't go there. But went to JP, and I did. I loved it. I loved the environment that I grew up in there. We had some amazing teachers, and it's the part of it, and I think it relates to everyone, is as a teacher, you have the greatest influence on your students. And that influence can go either way. And I think that same thing happened to me at JP. And I think that's why it's important to share that. Anyone listening to this podcast, you'd ask them now to pause and say, all right, I want you to stop. I want you to think of the teacher, your greatest teacher that influenced you. Or think of one of your greatest influences in your life. Probably 8 or 9 out of 10 people, it'll be a teacher. So as a teacher, you have that ability to influence people. And a good teacher is going to influence in the right way and in a positive way. Because sometimes when you say to people, think of a teacher, it could be a teacher that's really upset them, or that has been a negative influence in their lives, or whatever the case is. And I think certainly for me, going to JP, I had some great teachers, and one of my teachers was a strong influence for me going into teaching, and was also my rugby coach. And we still keep in touch now, Dave Pitcairn, and he's in Australia. He lives in Sydney, and he runs one of the Redham houses there. So it's just the whole camaraderie of growing up in the 80s, playing rugby with your mates, getting on the bus, going down to Eastgate, kind of spending sort of afternoons hanging around and just doing fun things. That was really exciting. I don't think that I had the greatest. I don't think that I had the greatest influence in terms of from an academic point of view, because I was incredibly lazy, as probably most teenage boys are. And the areas that I was stimulated, I did well. So I did well in history, I did well in English. But in other areas, I didn't, because I wasn't stimulated from that point of view. I was a school prefect for whatever that meant. And I think it's so interesting where you find JP, like a lot of monastic schools, has reunions. And kind of you go to your 10 reunion, your 20-year. I went to my 30-year reunion. And always most important is to see, do I look more fabulous than the others? And that is very important, because If you've only got one chin, then you're still good at your 30th reunion. And what's interesting is you see the guys that were really very aggressively kind of taking leading roles within the school, and that kind of are quite straightforward and have achieved, you would have expected something a lot more. And it's not a judgment on who achieves what or whatever it is. I remember at my 20th reunion, I'd said to one of the guys, they said, "So what are you doing now?" So I said, "I'm a school teacher." I didn't tell them at that point that I was a headmaster. And they said, "School teacher?" And he said, "Geez, Fuchs, I thought you'd amount to more than that." I said, "Oh, I'm enjoying it. I love teaching. It's yeah, but you don't make money in teaching." And so it was all about the money. And many of the guys, not many, I lie, a couple of the guys had made sure that they had the latest cars and they're really, flashy cars and that. And so it was a very interesting experience. And these were guys that sort of were quiet, that you didn't know existed in a school of 150 boys in a grade type of thing. So yeah, it's. I think the summation for me on JP, it was a great experience. I try and assist where I can from an educational point. I was very grateful. They asked me to be the guest of honor, the guest speaker at the valediction in 2015, which was my 30th year of leaving. And it was, and for me, it was probably one of the greatest speeches I'd ever given. Standing in that hall 30 years later, giving a speech and looking into the audience, and there were JP boys of all colors, which of course wasn't the case in 1985. When I matriculated, and I'd spoken to them about being disruptors and talking about disruptors and not accepting the status quo and focusing on being an individual. And it was a wonderful speech, and I still to this day maintain it was probably one of the greatest addresses I've ever given to an audience. So that was really exciting, going back to my old school 30 years later and having that. And in fact, when the evening finished, I think it was about 9 or 9:30. I eventually left there 12:30 that evening, because I just had these boys coming and talking and sharing and asking for advice and things like that. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. You go and speak, and normally your guest speaker disappears after half an hour or straight after the valediction. And I was there till 12:30, and I loved it. It was great.
That's the aggregate of that, those kind of, or the measure of those kind of speeches and interactions is very difficult, obviously, to quantify. But I just think it must be really rewarding to be able to at least imagine that you've influenced even just a few people in that crowd to make a change. That must be one of the best feelings possible, especially when you've just hit the sweet spot with a golf club or a cricket bat or whatever. And if you've had that with education or like inspiration, I think that's must be the best feeling. But a quick question on that: how do you get teenage boys or girls excited for school, for education, for learning? In a nutshell, is that something that you can sort of answer in a few minutes?
Yeah, I think it's about making it relevant, and that's the most important thing. Because how often both of you sat in class, "Oh, this is not relevant to me. This is completely. What am I going to do with this?" And that's the most important thing, is making it relevant. Modern education talks about collaboration. Modern education talks about sharing. It talks about the teacher being a facilitator and not a teacher standing in the front and kind of vomiting forth a load of rubbish, and I just take it in and I must regurgitate it. So sadly, that's the education I grew up with. And I think for me, it was always about getting the students excited, and I would always tell stories. So in history, I would tell stories, and I would relate the stories to the topic And the stories would be about me, the stories would be about people I knew, whatever it is, and get the students involved and engaged in that. I think that was important. On the same trip that I was in Canada in 2011, as a head, I never wanted to lose contact with my students. And that was one of the most important. That was the most important thing for me, was always my students. And I taught. So I still taught a class of history, and I still coached the water polo when I was a headmaster. And I was in Canada, in Toronto, so my history class thought, great, we got a week away, Fuchs is away, we can jawl and we can do what we want and have fun. And of course, I set them assignments via Facebook, our Facebook group that we'd created in 2011. Which was not the norm at that point in time. And I'd said to them, I've heard a statement here, and I want you to relate it to the South African context, and let's debate this via social media and on Facebook. And the statement was, when the peasants learn to read, the king is in trouble. And that was the homework. So just the statement and the homework. And of course, for them, you can imagine how they would take that and really kind of make it relevant to South African politics at that point in time, to their own situations and that. And so I think that's a good example of making it relevant, making it exciting, and keeping them stimulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, I actually had like goosebumps, I guess, just listening to what you just said there. And also, just having that influence on kids must be really, really cool. But it's also a big responsibility. When you finished school, Fuchs, it was obviously a different time back in South Africa, and everyone still had to go to the army. Well, guys had to go to the army and do their conscription. And I think you also had to do it when you finished school. But at the same time, you also had got into training in the gym, but we're starting to take it a little bit more seriously too, and we're a powerlifter. So do you just want to take us through that journey? And there's a couple of interesting stories in terms of how you were treated in the army, because you were allowed to train and things like that when other guys weren't.
Yeah, so I studied first. So at that point in time in the 80s, national conscription was for white male South Africans from the age of 16. So at the age of 16, normally in grade 10, you registered. The school by law had to register every single white male in the schools for army, and you got what you called your army number. And then you started receiving call-up papers to go to different units from then on. And just to go back a little bit, I think it was just something that, as a white South African teenager, this is what you grew up with. Everyone did it. Previously, a lot of your friends whose fathers were a lot younger did it in the 70s, in the 60s. So you just kind of thought it was normal and that you would just do this. And you had the choice. If you studied after school, you matriculated, you were exempt until you completed your studies. So I chose to get my studies out of the way first rather than go to the army like a lot of my mates did. And I studied first for doing my 4 years to get my teacher's qualification. And so when I went to the army, because I was qualified with a tertiary qualification, I was sent to officers' school, infantry school in Oudtshoorn, and obviously did my basic training. And one thing you have to do is you have to be qualified as you have to do sport. So in the afternoons, you have to do something. I was first team rugby at Jeppe. I did very well as a rugby player. I played for Wits a bit as well. And so obviously the natural thing in the army was to play some rugby. I said, I'm not playing rugby because I don't want to injure myself. That's quite important. I want to complete my officer's course and get my rank as a lieutenant. And that was quite an important milestone for me. And so I took up powerlifting because I'd known the gym for many years through my father as a kid, training in gyms and that. And I took up powerlifting, not to do anything silly, and competed and did quite nicely. I got competed at nationals for defense. At that point in time, South Africa was structured a little bit differently. Today we have 9 provinces. Then we had 4 provinces. So you had the Transvaal, the Cape, Natal, and the Free State. And from a sporting point of view, defense was a 5th province. So so for the Currie Cup or whatever it is, you would have defence playing in as part of a province. So you got defence colours meant you got provincial. And understandably, the South African Defence Force at that point in time was massive and was very competitive. So I got my defence colours and we competed at nationals and got a bronze in the powerlifting, which was very exciting. I didn't think I'd get something like that, and throwing around some nice weights, and it was a sport I started enjoying. And so towards the August time, having gone into the army in January, I've been training for 8 months. In August, I was training for Western Province champs. And at that point, we were out in the bush doing section kind of platoon phase attacks. And because I was quite a big guy, I was given the LMG, the light machine gun, to carry. And we on section attacks, the machine gunner, you have a number 2 that carries the belt of rounds, and the number 2 runs with you, and you kind of flank the platoon moving up, and you flank them on the right normally, and you run about 900 to 1,000 meters, and you set up the machine gun, and you'll fire onto the trenches, and the platoon then moves up. And we did about 10 of these section attacks that Thursday morning, 22nd of August, 1990. You see, I'm a history teacher, I know this. And we did about 10 of those. And that afternoon was training for powerlifting, and got onto the Sawmill, which was like a army truck, and it took us back to base, and went back to the gym and started training. And of course, being at that stage, 22 years old, I didn't think of the literally 10 kilometers of running that I'd done with the machine gun that morning, and started my training with squats. And normally we would start with some sort of light squats and start at 100 kilos and do a couple of reps there, then go to 150 and then 200. And the 200 kilogram, that was the end of the warm-up. And then from there, you obviously carry on squatting and doing, you go as heavy as you can. And up to 200, I never had more than one spotter. So I had one spotter, and once I went over kind of 200, 220, 250, I'd have a spotter on either side of the weights and a spotter behind me. So you always had 3 spotters. And yeah, I had one spotter. And of course, I was doing 200 kilo squat, part of the warm-up. It was 10 reps. And I can't remember, I'd got into probably my 8th rep or whatever, and my legs literally just fatigued because of the morning and everything. And I got stuck in the full squat at the bottom. So the guy spotting me, I said to him, listen, get the weight off. And he panicked. He lifted it off my shoulders and couldn't lift it, obviously, and then dropped it back onto my neck. And so at this point, I had 200 kilos in a full squat, kind of squashing me, and I had the choice of that or trying to get this weight off. So I kind of pulled my neck down, rolled the weight off, and as I rolled the weight off, the bar caught between a plate on the bottom of the squat stand and took off 2 of my fingers. And
no
and at that point, I'd felt it, but I thought, oh, damn it, I've broken a nail. I mean, break a nail it's tragic. You can't. I've got to go back to the bush. And this is terrible. And so while I'd managed, I'd got the weight off, I then stood up, and obviously I had my squat suit on and my wraps around my knees and everything that I was trying to, and this blood kind of coming out of my hand, and I was looking at it thinking, okay, I've broken it now. And the next thing, one of the guys in the gym in Afrikaans swore, saying, Fuchs, your fingers are lying on the floor. And at that point, there was these 2 parts of fingers lying on the floor, and no one wanted to pick it up. I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, come on, throw me a bone. And so I picked. So of course, at that point, the guy spotting me, old Earless, I can't remember his first name, but he went absolutely pale and just stood there in shock. So of course, at that point, what do? You're going to overdrive and grab the pressure points, stop the bleeding, pick up the fingers, put them in your hand, and start heading for the sick bay. And this guy Earless walked with me, and I eventually was obviously losing quite a lot of blood, and a van, the tuck shop van, the army tuck shop van, drove past, and he stopped them, and they kind of put me in the back, and there I sat with these fingers and the blood and these fresh meat patties that were going to the tuck shop. And they eventually got me to the sick bay, and then the medics took over, and they managed to save one of the fingers, and then one of the digits obviously was too badly crushed. They couldn't do anything with it. And that story has been with me forever. And interestingly, you are 2 of very few people that have now just heard the story, because for 28 years of teaching, I never told the students what had happened. Never.
And they all wanted to know.
Of course they did. And it was from shark attacks to, now and then someone tells us, no, didn't you lose it in weightlifting? I said, well, why do you make up stories? Why do you spread rumors? And in fact, once I had a wonderful grade that I taught from grade 8 to matric history. And I promised them on the last day of teaching history, I would tell them the story. And normally by that point in time, your matric students never come to class. They don't go to school, and they had enough. And interesting, on the day I was telling the story that as promised, every single kid was there. And what was been fascinating is not one of them ever shared the story, because they knew they were like a select few that had the story. So it was I'm sure many people have had other incidences, but this was something that kind of went with me. And even in water polo, when you blow a 4 meter or 5 meter penalty, so is that a 4.5 meter penalty? Is that, and I used to use a wonderful thing with the boys in rugby where they were concussed, or they'd take a knock. And they'd be lying on the back. I'd run on as a coach and go, right, what's happening? And I'd say, how many fingers? And they'd go, 4.5. I said, you're fine, get back on. And the moment they said 5, if they said 5, I was like, get him off immediately. There's no way. So we used it for some good things.
So Shaun, at that stage, you'd be pretty sporty. You'd also done a bit of marathon running. Did that come later on, that you got into more of like the that side of sport, or did you sort of give the weightlifting up at that stage for good, or what was the story there?
Yeah, so the marathon running and the ultra marathons was earlier on. When I was in matric, I'd decided for some reason that I wanted to run a marathon, as one does. You just want to run 42 Ks. It's quite straightforward, and you put on shoes and you run. And in those days, you just got a pair of tackies. It wasn't this Nike Air, this and that. I can't even remember the make of tacky I got. And I still used my brother's ID number, because it was the Johannesburg Nashua Marathon. And it was in October, 10th of October, 1985, and I was still 17. And to run a marathon, you have to be 18. So I used my brother's ID and ran as him. So he actually ran the first marathon, not me. But I still finished that marathon at 17, and then wanted to. And it wasn't natural. I'm not a natural runner. I don't have the build for. I'm big boned. I don't have the build for running marathons. And and obviously running that marathon, I'd kind of set myself a goal to complete the Comrades Marathon, which is a 90-kilometer marathon, Durban-Pietermaritzburg or Pietermaritzburg to Durban, before I was 20, and I did that. In 1988, I ran the Comrades Marathon. 20, should never have done it, was too young. Since then, massive ITB problems, but it was one of those things you tick off. You've done it, finished. I finished it with 20 minutes to spare. and I was 20 years old, so I was excited about doing that.
Yeah,
and then I went back to my gym and powerlifting.
Oh, yeah.
And so, Fuchs, you quite humbly kind of skittled over some of, like, I guess the weights and stuff you're pushing, but it's still really interesting. Like, you know, obviously to get your powerlifting colors is a big deal, and you need to push some serious weight. So, out of interest, what were your exercises and what weights were you lifting?
So training was very different. It wasn't. Training was not scientific then. It was pure hardcore weight training, which I still can't get out of my system today when I train. So which is good or bad, but that's kind of I think it's in my genetic makeup that's just how you train. And so you trained. And you kept to the basics, and I think that was very important with powerlifting, certainly. With powerlifting, very different. A lot of people confuse powerlifting with weightlifting. Weightlifting is the Olympic sport, the snatch and grab. CrossFit probably has got far more of an influence with weightlifting than with powerlifting. So for me, the powerlifting, I tried a bit of weightlifting, didn't like it at all, and a lot of technique, but good strength in there. Whereas powerlifting was really pure strength and some technique. And so you focus on 3 exercises which you combine the weights: bench press, squat, and deadlift. And my bench press was never great. You have to do 1 full rep. The judges have to give you the okay as you lower the weight onto your chest, and then you can push. And then once the judges give the okay, your spotters can remove it. So my bench press was about 180 kilos competing in terms of my press. In deadlift was really my strongest. I'd managed to deadlift over 350 kilos. My squat was okay. My squat, I'd kind of got into the 280, 290. I think on one occasion I managed to do a 310, that's always an interesting one, because when you load the bar onto your shoulder, the bar completely bends, so it almost goes into a delicate U. And it's dangerous. It's a dangerous activity.
Yes. Did you have injuries?
To have injuries, Craig, weren't you listening? I lost a finger.
Yes, but you got to listen. Be more observant.
Focus. Yeah. He hasn't shown me. I haven't been knocked out yet, so he hasn't given me the sign. Sorry, I still wanted to know. Like, did you get were you like having to push through like shoulder stuff or knee stuff, or or did that, because you're talking about the science of it and that kind of thing. And these days, there's so many people out there going, form and this and that, and people, really get high and mighty and holier than thou about these kind of things. Like you said, for good or bad. But in your case, you didn't actually, get bad shoulder stuff. And it was
never an issue. It was never an issue for me. And I think with any training, form is always the most important thing. I mean, even if I train today and I'm in the gym and you see someone, a youngster, or it doesn't matter the age, and their form is really bad, it drives me insane. I remember growing up in my dad's gyms, and there's nowhere on this earth you would train, your form would be bad, because someone in the gym would just pop over and give you a bit of guidance and say, hang on, if you're battling with your barbell curls and you are swinging so much, just lean against the pillar. So put your shoulder blades against the pillar, stabilize, and just do the exercise and slow down, take a lighter weight. There's those kind of things. Whereas today you don't get that. You don't get that always.
Yeah, and sure. It's so interesting. And then I know this question is going to be kind of multi-layered and a few questions. I still remember when I was 16, you took me for pretty much one of my first weight training sessions at the Fourways Health and Racket at the time. And I can still literally picture it, like you giving me advice, like how to do leg extensions properly in terms of like just the timing, you know, like to do it nice and slow, both up and down. And then with chest, with bench press, you're like, cool, you're a spotter, you have a responsibility, but so does the guy doing the exercise. So you know, the guy that's doing the exercise lifts it up initially with a little bit of a spot, and then he goes, okay, cool, 1, 2, 3, mine. And then I literally can still make sure it's, and I still practice that if I train myself or with other people to this day. So obviously form was a big thing and always has been. And for you, training has been like a massive part of your life and still is, like even to this day, you're still hitting the gym, which is, I think, super important and, you know, just for everybody to do, you know, and like at 50, you're going into the gym and you're smashing like heavy weights still, and, you know, which is really, really impressive. And I think lots of people kind of give up on it too soon. So that's not really a question, just more like, I guess, an observation. But you also, you know, your dad managed those couple of gyms in Hillbrow, and you also worked at probably one of the most famous South African guys, Reg Park, his gym in Hillbrow too, where there was lots of famous bodybuilders at the time that would go and train there. So can you tell us a little bit about that? But then also, there's some cool stories about you when you used to train, and you would have people that would literally watch you in the gym because they'd kind of never seen guys lift weights like that, and you'd sort of get crowds around you. So, yeah, can you tell us more about those, please?
Yeah, so my dad had always been very good about looking after his health, and he was born in 1920. So was definitely ahead of his generation from that point of view. And he, in the 70s, bought 2 gyms. He bought City Health Studio in Rissik Street, and he bought American Health Studio in Pretoria Street in Hillbrow, right near High Point. And that was in the 70s. In the 70s, Hillbrow was sort of the Manhattan of South Africa, I suppose. And was an incredibly vibey and just a different place. And so in the 80s, in 1980, when and I think it was in 76, when in 1980 they had the Mr. Olympia, and Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno, they'd come out and they trained at my dad's gym, the City Health Studio, and actually at the American Health. And I remember them signing the wall. And kind of, you know, my dad's name was Wilfred, and they say, good luck, Wolf, and kind of messages. And of course, I remember for years, no one ever painted over that. So whenever the gym was freshened up with paint, those areas where Arnold Schwarzenegger and Frank Zane and Lou Ferrigno and Columbo, Franco Columbo had written and it's autographed, was never painted over. So that was really, I think, quite an exciting. You can imagine me, at the age of 13, and sort of seeing this. So that was really quite an inspirational kind of thing. And these guys were massive. I mean, they were just unbelievably massive. But I always remember they enjoyed their training. And that was a key part. And, you know, you go back to the observation, you talk about still training today. You have to enjoy it. You must just, if you enjoy it and you're having fun, that's a critical part. And then later on, when I was competing, certainly after when I was doing squats, and I was certainly I was training at Santon Health and Racket, and it's probably because it was the Santon Health and Racket Club, and with a lot of businessmen and executives there, that they might not have seen that. I think it was any other gym, no one would have blinked an eye. And so the moment you kind of went to 200 kilos, and remember in the gym, you don't have the weight. Sometimes in powerlifting, you have one plate is 50 kilos. So you can have 4 plates and it's 200 kilos, whereas in the normal gyms, one big plate is 20 kilos. So to put 200 kilos on, you need 5 on each side. And when you go on to 250 kilos, you've got 6 on each side plus, and there's no more space. And that's what used to happen. So I don't think it was the weight. It was just the volume of plates that was on there, because in powerlifting, that would have been 4 plates or 4 plates and a bit wouldn't be an issue. And the guys did. They would stop and then they'd come and cheer and sort of look and comment. And, all I wanted to do was do my squats and keep my fingers intact and go home,
Oh, that's so funny.
And so, Shaun, you spoke about your brother as well briefly, and was this a family of sporty people as well? I know was sort of got into the military sort of side of things as well, which I'd like to sort of unpack a little bit in a second. But was the whole family sort of sporty, as it were?
Yeah, my dad obviously always was very involved and busy with that, sport and training. I think just myself and probably my younger brother. So my older brother never really took to sport, I suppose, the way that I did. He competed. He ran a marathon. So he did try and get involved, but I don't think he competed the way I certainly competed at that level.
And so your one brother was actually sort of in the security sort of industry, is that right? Yeah. And he's got quite an interesting story about sort of being part of a detail that sort of looked after Morgan Tsvangirai in Zimbabwe. That's must be a really fascinating situation to find yourself in. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so when he was a year ahead of me, so when he matriculated in 1984, he went straight into the military at that point, and was quite interested in going into special forces, which he did. So he served in South African special forces at that time in the Angolan War, and had always kind of been involved from that point for a number of years after his national service. In the special forces doing ops and that, which him and I have never actually discussed. We've never ever discussed his experiences and his involvement, but he always had that interest in special forces and in the military, and naturally coming into South Africa in the 90s, they extended that to start his own security firm, which he then sold. And then from there, he started a VIP protection business, and a number of his clients were obviously very high profile. Charlize Theron, he would been involved in her bodyguarding her, Will Smith, obviously a number of top business people from the Middle East, and Morgan Tsvangirai was one of them that he was very involved in terms of bodyguarding. So they'd employed his company, and because he was so good at it, he always obviously had contracted guys that worked for him as bodyguards. But he was very involved with the detail, looking after Morgan Tsvangirai, particularly when he came to South Africa, but also when he went to Zimbabwe at a very difficult time in the Zimbabwean kind of politics. And the interesting thing was, whilst he was bodyguarding Morgan Tsvangirai, I was headmaster at Crawford Lonehill, and Morgan's 2 children, his daughter and his son, were at my school at that point in time. So the Fuchs family were kind of quite involved looking after the Morgan Tsvangirai's family. Yeah.
And did he go into like any sort of detail at all about what was like involved, say, to look after Morgan, and any stories like about Mugabe, or was there,
No, it's such a professional run business that he would never discuss those details.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for you, Shaun, there was, like obviously you became a school teacher, and but you also have a lot of entrepreneurial spirits in you, and you've, through your career as a teacher and a principal, you also had a lot of like side hustles. Do you think that sort of originated from your dad? and what sort of things did you first get into? And I guess also as part of the story, when you started your first business, or the one that I know of at least, your travel business, you started it with your husband, Gordon. So can we maybe just get into both of those kind of stories a little bit, how you met Gordon, and then, your side hustles, and a little bit about those?
Sure. So Gordon and I met in 1992. So we've just, in November last year, celebrated our 25th anniversary. And he was also a JP boy, but 5 years behind me. So we weren't at school together. And somewhere along the line, I supposedly coached him rugby. I don't think he was a great rugby player, and I've told him this because I don't really remember that, but he remembers it well as a 13-year-old. And I'd left the army. I was busy teaching at Four Ways High School. He went to the Navy, had served in the South African Navy, had just left that and was working. And we met at one of the clubs in Bromfontein, and that was in '92. And he was 19, I was 24, and I think it was also a very different time in South Africa, because there was most definitely there was a huge amount of homophobia at that point in time. There was a lot of gay bashings, particularly with gay people walking from the clubs to their cars, to the car parks. You would have groups of people that would sort of gay bash. And certainly your rights weren't entrenched as they are today in the South African Constitution. So we were in '92, and me being in teaching had to be incredibly private about that. That was really frustrating for me. In '94. We went overseas for his 21st. I bought him a ticket to go to Europe, and I had to. And obviously, as far as the school was concerned, he was just a friend of mine. There were two buddies that were going to go overseas, and I remember coming back from that trip, and someone obviously somewhere had picked up that I was gay, and had sprayed on the front wall at the entrance of the school in large kind of in a blue. Spray kind of lettering, Fuchs, you faggot. And I remember that well, arriving back into the start of the third term. I'd been overseas, I'd taken some extra leave, and seeing that on day one. And that was a massive change, certainly in terms of how I was going to approach things going forward. It was at the time of the democratic transition for South Africa. We had this constitution where rights, or human rights, were enshrined, including sexual orientation, and I wasn't prepared to take that. And for me, I made the decision that I'm not going to hide who I am. I'm a human being. I have a very positive influence on people's lives. I can have it. And I think the fact of my sexuality has nothing to do with who I am as a person, as no one else's sexuality has to do with who they are as a person. We're all unique, and we all have strong traits in that. And from there, I stopped kind of pretending, and was very sort of was open about who I was. Met resistance, obviously, from a number of people, but for the majority of people, no, people were accepting. It was unusual to have an openly gay person who was a powerlifter, who was coaching water polo, who coached the provincial and national water polo, coaching first team rugby at a very good school. And so I think it was also about killing stereotypes and about saying it's just about people more than anything else.
Yes, that's really well said. I think, in Australia, they've just had the plebiscite, and they've, it just, Gareth and I obviously have discussed this a few times. It just blows you away that kind of thing, your sexual orientation, is still something that other people can have an opinion about. I just can't really begin to understand it in this day and age, in a sort of, to all intents and purposes, a very first world country like Australia, that's still something that people have to ask if it's okay, that kind of thing. It's unbelievable. I guess up until this stage, for example, in the army, you just kept it on the lowdown, obviously, because in the army, it's obviously people wouldn't want to have known that at that stage. Did you keep it on the lowdown?
It was one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to make in my life. And it was when you go into the army, you register and you fill in forms, and they don't do anything to you until you get a medical clearance, which at that point was called a G1K1. And if you got a G1K1, it meant psychologically you were good and physically you were good, which meant they could train you and basically beat the crap into you for the next 6 months, or your basic training, whatever it was. And one of the questions that's asked in the psychological one is, are you homosexual? Have you had any sexual relations with person of the same sex? And it was difficult for me because I just recently qualified as a teacher. I'd had 4 years of tertiary education. You're a free-thinking human being, and now you've got to lie about it. And I did say no, because if I'd said yes, I would have been immediately not been given a full classification and either been discharged from the army at that point, or would have been sent through to the catering corps or to an admin position with no rank whatsoever. So for me, it was actually about trying to prove, actually, this is bullshit. It's got nothing to do with my sexual orientation. And I will show you, and I did. I became the chairperson of the company, the Bravo company at that point in time. I competed in powerlifting. I got my rank as an officer. So it was completely, it contradicted completely what they were doing. And of course, at that point in time, they were also experimenting on gay guys in the army and doing medical experiments of shock tactics and treatment and that. And I mean, that came out in the last couple of years. So it wasn't a great place to be as a human being. And so you kind of fought that prejudice. And for me, it was always important to be a good role model, to show people that actually sexual orientation has nothing to do with who you are as a person. And many of my students who've come out through the years, and I think that has helped them to an extent, and to some I remember clearly one day getting a note on my desk from a 15-year-old student who was in grade 9 at that point in time, saying that he wrote me quite a long letter, and at the end he had written that I think that I'm gay. And of course, I called him in and spoke to him and was very positive about it. And he came from a family that he felt it wouldn't be accepted. And I'd kind of been there to support him through his schooling career, and interestingly received a Facebook message from him about a year ago, and he's now overseas. He's happily married to his husband, and he makes it clear that he felt at that point in time, putting the letter on my desk, he was wanting to actually commit suicide. Wow. And it's the satisfaction, and satisfaction is not the right word. The humbling, the feeling of actually being in a position where you've changed someone's life to the point where they realize they didn't need to actually take their life and commit suicide was massive. Absolutely massive. And, it goes back to that comment I made about you never see your end product. I never would have known that. But in his mind, it was important to give me that message, which he did, and that was really humbling.
Shaun, I think it just shows once again that in this day and age, it's so worth just to be more of yourself and be as positive as you can about your traits and who you are in whatever regard, and that influences people. Like you say, not knowing the outcome of those people, one should be doing stuff during your journey, along your life journey, that is positive without needing to know how that affects someone else. But you just put it out there in as positive a way as possible. and in some way, shape, or form, it does influence people. You might never know about it, but it just does. So I think it's just a real testament to those kind of scenarios where you could have handled it differently, and that person's life could have been very different as well.
And I think in my situation, the story is about the fact that you were mentoring and helping a young gay kind of student to understand that there's nothing wrong with him, that he's absolutely normal, and I don't use the word normal lightly because it's what is normal, but there's nothing wrong with him. He's fine. He's a functional human being. He's a wonderful person. And many teachers, many of my colleagues have done similar things with different stories and different storylines. And it goes back to my earlier comment of just saying the greatest influences in your life is probably a teacher, and so that's just one of the stories along certainly my journey.
And Shaun, how did your parents I guess, react when you told them, look, I'm gay? What was their reaction to it? Gordon and I had made a decision. We were together at that point for about a year, and my parents we hadn't told them. And friends of ours that we knew, also a young gay couple, drove through to Pretoria to go to a club the one night, came back and were killed in a car accident. One of them was killed. And at the funeral, the family found out, and it turned absolutely ugly, terrible. Yes. And we said, we're not going to have this. We can't have this. This is not going to happen. So I actually flew down literally the following weekend to my folks in East London, and around the dinner table, sort of, could you pass me the salt? By the way, I'm a homosexual. And something along those lines. And spent time with them, just talking and almost counseling them along that it's fine. This is, with Gordon, this is a person that I'm involved with and have chosen to be my life partner, and they were fine. My father was fine with it. They accepted it. They embraced it. Difficult. Parents always think immediately, what did I do wrong? Mothers in particular, what I do wrong, and parents often think, what will other people say? I'm okay with it, but what will other people say? And you've got to convince them. It's not about what other people say. It's about my own happiness. And I'm okay. And I think that's one of the issues that very often, and it's not just on being gay, whether it's sometimes interracial marriages, whatever, the moment it becomes steps out of what normal society, what the norm is expected, or the stereotype, it's always about what will other people say. And I think it was managing that more than anything else.
It's when light's shining on a subject, it's not nearly as scary as, or we're not as, what is the word? It's not as hidden, and when, like you said earlier, when you've discussed and it's all open, and like with say black people in your class, or whatever, and it just becomes a normal thing that you can have a discussion about. It's not nearly necessarily as scary and what have you as you thought. So that just shows once again that open communication is the way to go. It might be horrible initially to get over that hurdle, but afterwards, wow, okay, well, Shaun's still Shaun. He's a good bloke, and nothing has actually changed.
Yeah, it's again, I would argue, and if you study cultural anthropology, I would argue that this podcast in 20 years' time, people would be absolutely astounded at in terms of the conversation. And the historical reasoning is, if you go back to sort of the 1920s, the sort of the vote for women, when the vote for women was given, you can trace any kind of history behind it. It was the entire world is going to fall down. There is no ways that women could actually have the reasoning to make a clear decision on voting. We can't do this. We can't allow it. So society needed to adjust to women voting, 1920s, 1930s in some countries. And then as we progress through kind of the 20th century and you look at the different issues, the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, where black people were saying, we actually have rights. We're citizens of this country. I'm not sitting on the back of the bus. I'm going to sit in the front of the bus. I'm going to go and study at university. And the society kind of, this can't happen. The world's falling apart. 30 years later, they have a black president. No one blinks an eye because people eventually adjust. You have the animal rights movement of the 80s, where animals actually have rights. And so kind of the 90s and the noughties became a period of the kind of gay rights, especially up to now. And kind of Australia just has come on the tail end of it to a large extent in terms of Western society, which still amazes me to this point in time that where Australia is, or at least has got to now, thank goodness. But the point is, in 20 years' time, it's going to be completely something else. You know, we're not even going to blink. It's not even going to be an issue. It's going to be absolutely integrated into society, like the examples I kind of gave through the 20th century.
100%.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I also think it's quite sad that even in this day and age, we're kind of having to talk to you about and ask you a question like that because it's kind of like not the norm. You know what I mean? Like, we're still, even though we've advanced and progressed so much in recent history, we're still so primitive, I guess, as humans in the way we think and the things we think about and what is weird. And like, you know, like, why is an interracial relationship still something that's like, oh, it's kind of weird in a way, you know what I mean? And why is because this guy's gay or this lady's lesbian or whatever, it's still something that's like topical. It's kind of weird, and I do really hope that in 30 years' time, there is no weird anymore, and everything is just a normal. Yeah,
I think it will be. I do think it will be.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean,
I think what happens is that over the years, it's all about in tribe and out tribe, and so you've got, you know, this is our little group in the Middle Ages. Our town has to protect our people from those people, and then it just as the world has gotten smaller in sort of relative terms, I guess, that they're still in and out of a tribe, and we're still very, like you said, primitive minded in that regard, and slowly but surely I think some of those fences are falling in different areas and going, well, it's not about being in and out of our little tribe, and we have to try and that tribalism needs to slowly but surely, I think, move away, and we need to integrate more. And I think these are all just, like you said, Shaun, those are just little fences falling along that journey, getting out of our little small-minded tribalism sort of brain, you know.
Yeah, agreed. And it's one of the, you know, it's the other interesting thing, I think, is the moment society's faced with something new, they step back and they become conservative. And it's probably a topic for another day, but I still think the election of someone like Donald Trump was under Barack Obama, there was so much new being faced. There was the gay rights being enshrined. There was from healthcare to all sorts of things that were taking place. And it was very liberal. It was very kind of new that was being faced. And people go, hang on, this is too much. We need to step back. We need to become conservative because that's the space that we're comfortable with. And I still think that's kind of why we sit where we are at the moment and the problems we are facing with right now, because society's taken a back step, but will ultimately move forward. That's the nature. That's our history. That's what history has taught us.
Yeah. And so let's just backtrack a tiny little bit. And we sort of touched on a little bit. You and Gordon started your own travel business when you guys were both quite young. And what kind of manifested that? And can you just tell us a little bit about it, you know, in terms of, you know, it's not all plain sailing, that's for sure. You know, you have to make a lot of sacrifices, I guess personally as well as like financially. And there's a lot of lessons to be learnt in how to set up, I guess, your own business as well as like for you it was a side business because you were teaching as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, extra commitments from a time perspective, etc.
Yeah, I think so. I think a comment is that can you learn entrepreneurship? I think to an extent, yes. But for a lot of people, I think being an entrepreneur it's in your blood. It's just who you are. It's your makeup. Because some people will see it and do it, and others won't. And for me, entrepreneurship was very natural for me. In my school holidays as a young kid in primary school, early high school, I spent many years in my school holidays with my dad, traveling, going to see his customers. How did he speak to them? What did he do? And kind of learning all of that. And that sort of became a very natural thing for me. None of my siblings did that. And so as much as I always knew I was going to be a teacher, I always had a very strong business kind of understanding of things and an entrepreneurial kind of way. And so we started in 96. We were 2 years out of apartheid, 2 years in the new democratic South Africa. Markets were opened. You could travel freely, and schools were starting to do a lot of tours. And at that point, I'd been in teaching for about 4 years or 5 years, and it was very natural to organize school tours. And that's exactly what we then decided to do. We started a company called Travel Mania. And we did school tours. We did sporting tours overseas, and we did educational tours overseas, taking kids overseas. And the exciting part for me was my passion for history, my passion for sport was in something that I really loved. We loved that first trip in '94 when we went overseas and the experience. And so we really wanted to get schools and kids traveling. And so started the business in 1996. And since then have taken thousands of kids all over the world on trips. And Gordon had left his job at that point in time and went into it full time. I didn't want to leave teaching because the business was also a natural complement to what we were doing. So I didn't want to leave teaching and stayed in teaching, and naturally also got the business. And we started that business with literally a bonus that I got for coaching rugby, and had 2 plastic laundry baskets turned upside down with a chipboard top and a tablecloth as the table. And in the Star Classified section, that's a newspaper, we found a second-hand printer and computer. And we bought that, I think, for like 300 Rand at that point, and started the business. Got 2 telephone lines, one fax line and one normal line, and started the business like that in our spare room. And that business has done incredibly well, and we've been very blessed with the opportunities we've had. And I mean, we've both traveled literally every single continent, have been to dozens and dozens of cities, countries, and so we've loved it and have loved sharing those experiences. So that's been fantastic.
And you say dozens of cities. Sorry there, Craig. You say dozens of cities. Like I was reading something on you the other day, and it was like 200 cities, more like it. So it's quite a lot of dozens.
Hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah, it's been a few, and it's so nice, especially again as a history teacher. You know the history, and if you don't, you read up and you learn and you understand it, and again it goes back to the earlier part of the conversation that we're born and bred and have lived in Joburg our whole lives, but we have traveled the world because it has become a much smaller place. But those experiences have been critical in certainly the makeup of who I am and who Gordon is and what we do. You know, we have a wonderful home in sort of a holiday home in the Western Cape in Pringle Bay, and literally everything there is from our travels around the world. So we have stuff there that we've bought and brought across, and it's not just your stock standard IKEA, suppose you would understand, or whatever it is going to get, and that's great to be able to have that as well.
It sounds to me like some kind of panacea of entrepreneurship to be able to contribute, make some money, and have fun while you're doing so. So I think you've done pretty well there.
Yeah, you have to have fun. I mean, the moment you stop having fun, stop doing what you're doing. I think that's absolutely important. And for me, I always argue that the moment you need a purpose is absolutely critical. If you don't have a purpose, what's the point? And the purpose can be anything. There's no right or wrong. It can be anything. And if you're having fun in that process, even better. You'll love it. You'll love what you're doing. And it's the same. I can see with the two of you. You've got a purpose in your mind as to what you're doing, particularly with Ridiculously Human, and you're having fun. You're having a lot of fun doing it. So you're going to continue doing it. When you stop having fun, you'll stop doing it.
Well, when we get to chat to interesting people that have 4.5 fingers, I think, who wouldn't find that a lot of fun?
Yeah.
And Shaun, did you stop teaching because you were not having fun anymore? Is that your reason?
No, I think I wanted to explore. I'd done the entrepreneurship with a number of small businesses along the way. I'd done the teaching. I'd set myself goals of being a headmaster, head of a school, having my own school and kind of having my own influence on that school and developing it. And I don't think it's healthy to be the head of a school for too long. Someone else needs to come along and someone else needs to do it. And I think that was the point I was at, where I felt I'd done my work and I needed to move on. I was the head for, I think, just over 6 years, which was more than enough time to change people's lives, do things and move on. And so the corporate aspect of managing schools was available, and I took that. And again, I've continued to have fun and enjoy it, but it's nowhere near the level that you have when you're on the ground. You can't ever replace that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And when you left school, there was was it a video that they created, or they actually did it in person? Like they created this amazing video for you to say thank you. I think in your final assembly. What was that again? Sorry.
Yeah, it was probably one of the greatest experiences, certainly of my life. It was that final assembly, and they'd invited Gordon, they'd invited my mom, had come to that, and they put together literally an hour-and-a-half production from each grade, from each experience. Every grade that put something together. Of course, the 4.5 fingers came up in that. So it was absolutely amazing, and I obviously spoke to them and shared my journey along with them. And I think one of the interesting things of that week, that last week of being the head of the school, was the school, the editor of the school magazine came to interview me and had asked, what would I be remembered at? What was the important thing? And I couldn't answer it actually at that point in time, and spent a couple of days thinking about it because I wanted to discuss it with the school when on my final assembly. And I said, actually, what I think was the critical part for me was that when I thought about why did I become a teacher, why this, why that, and it was really the fact that I was able to influence people's lives, and some you knew about and some you didn't know about, and I think that was the milestone for me in that part. And they put together a really amazing video that obviously I still have, and that's spent some times looking at snippets of it and being quite nostalgic.
I can imagine it must have been really moving for you, but and also, I suppose, tough at the same time, and must have been a really emotional sort of week or two of that transition period, I'd imagine.
It was enormously emotional. I mean, I just if I think of it now, I even get emotional about it because it was one of the hardest things to actually move from a career that I'd been in for 25 years at that point in time. The kids, the importance of it, the fun of it, everything, and changing to something completely different. It was massive, absolutely massive.
And sorry, I just would like to go a bit deeper, like into the sort of like side hustle type of thing. Like you've done so many things like while you've been a teacher, and it takes a certain skill as well as like determination and a whole lot of other things to run these. So like you obviously you had the travel business, you've had some restaurants and takeaways, a phone repair business. You're also a professional public speaker. So we're talking about a lot of things here. You've done a lot of stuff and done it really, really well. How do you do that after, say, like a day of teaching, then a day as well as like coaching sports, and then having to mark papers? You know what I mean? Like you get home and you must be pretty damn tired. Like what skills did you have that made you able to do this, and what advice can you give people that are looking to do the same?
I think for me it was always natural. It was a very natural thing to do. So I never ever thought it was any different to what anyone else was doing. I think key parts of it is a strong focus. Maintain your focus. What is it you want to do, and what is your purpose? And again, going back to the having fun part, I don't think any business, whether it was the something fishy that Craig was driving through and buying his fish and chips or whatever it was, having fun doing that, whether it was the restaurants, whether it was the mobile phone repair business, it doesn't matter what it was, the travel, teaching, it was the element of really having fun and doing something that you enjoy. And I think that's where you find people are incredibly successful. So, the skills, I'm not sure. I think we all have different skills and different strengths. But understand your purpose, have fun doing it, and the rest will come naturally. There were many businesses there were many areas that didn't work very well. We tend to always face, like Facebook, you tend to only see the happy stories and life is so great and amazing, but actually you don't see the tragedy, you don't see the difficulties, and there you probably need far more skills to cope with those than you do on all the good things.
Yeah, when the cracks start to show in certain scenarios, I guess that's when you really learn how to figure things out, troubleshoot, take your time, use the help of others. All these little skills come into play, I guess, and that's we don't often project those kind of things when we talk about our successes, and those are always the fun things to discuss, I guess.
Yeah, and I also think that sharing and relying on people, because support structures are critical. I could never have achieved, if we call it achievement, I could never have enjoyed my journey if it hadn't been for Gordon supporting me, or my parents, or my friends. That's vital. You don't do it on your own. So certainly the stories that I give from powerlifting wasn't just me. It was the guys spotting me, the guys motivating me, the guys training me, teaching. Many of the stories, there's always people involved. And I think, we ask, how do people, what success and what skills, and that you need to rely on people, because we cannot do it on our own.
And when you talk about people and, also some of the stuff we spoke about just now about like being gay and talking openly and stuff like that, and then also now about things that are not good, I'm sure you've had, like, say, parents, for example, that have been probably unaccepting for who you are. Do you know what I mean? And like, okay, we've got this gay man and he's the principal and he teaches water polo and rugby and I can't handle that. I'm sure you've had many parents come to you, or just like maybe heard of people complaining or whatever? And if so, like, how have you dealt with it, and what, you know?
In my 28 years in education, only twice.
Okay.
So, and the one was right in the beginning, and who, when in '94, when I'd first come out, who said that, who'd instructed the head at that point in time, that my headmaster at that point in time, Malcolm Park, to get rid of me because they can't have this person, teaching our kids. And of course, he told them to get stuffed. And the other time was when I was a head and was an ultra-religious family that had a massive objection to it. And the school, the organization I was with at that point in time, were completely supportive and basically told them to get stuffed if they didn't like it.
Wow, that's a good story.
And go, Craig.
I was going to say, I guess, Shaun, you come across. I'm just trying to understand how that comes about. Like, only twice in one career. To me, that sounds like very few. Forgetting the fact that you're gay, just as a teacher, I could imagine I've had teachers, friends of mine, just tell me that they're getting it all the time. Do you think that has something to do with, and this is probably a life, sort of in life in general, to do with one's certainty about oneself, or is it something that you can learn, like if you just become really good at what you do, or is it a bit of a combination of things?
It's probably a combination, and I think it's how you treat people, and that's the important part. And the treating of people in terms of the mutual respect and how you handle things, and I think that creates a perception of you, it creates an image of you, it creates a character of you, and it's how people respond to that is very important. And I'm sure behind the scenes there were many occasions that I'm not aware of. I'm sure there were, of course there were. But again, I think it's how you treat people.
And Shaun, I know we've had you on the line for a while now. There's one other thing that I would like to get into, and I don't know, might take a little bit of time, but you are the forever optimist about South Africa. You always have been. Whenever I have spoken to you about it, you've always been like probably one of two people I would always come to sort of understand about what is going on in South Africa, what are your thoughts about it, what are your thoughts about the future. So like a couple of things. Even though South Africa has had a sort of, let's say, colourful and I guess in a way kind of strange past in terms of apartheid, since then they've also been fairly progressive. One of those is around gay marriage, so it's one of the first countries, as far as I know, to actually make it legal. And you and Gordon got married not long after that happened. And then the second part is South Africa's still obviously going through a lot of change. What are your and you always have like a very good view on it, based on like your knowledge of history, based on the people that you interact with in terms of just in your social network, but as well as like teachers and businessmen. What are your thoughts on what is currently going on and what like the future looks like?
I think we're getting to the end of a particular era. The era was an absolute tragedy in the South African history. I think every bit of everything that was right in South Africa was not working. And where we should have been concentrating on moving forward with South Africa and uplifting sort of people and solving educational problems. We have one of the biggest spends, GDP spends in education, yet our education system is completely dysfunctional to a large extent. If you look at the statistics on the hundreds of thousands of students that start grade 1 and the handful that finish in matric, it's an absolute tragedy. It's shocking. So, and those weren't concentrated on. We had a government led by a president that looted South Africa of its wealth, that was completely corrupt, that has been proven to be corrupt. And I still feel that that government and that president will see their time certainly in court. And I hope we don't get out of it. I think Mugabe stepping down last year is a start of what would then move down to South Africa. The recent elections of Cyril Ramaphosa is incredibly positive. South Africans are positive about that. The strengthening of the opposition. You can't have a functional democracy if you don't have a strong opposition. So you have to have a strong opposition. It doesn't matter who the opposition is. You have to have a strong opposition. And so the opposition is strengthening. The opposition is getting better. And so, unfortunately, in some aspects, we haven't progressed. We still have absolute poverty. We still have people living in kind of historic areas of apartheid that are incredibly poor, that don't have decent homes. And so we have an incredibly long way to go. Am I optimistic about the future? Yes, I certainly am. Why? Because the one thing that has kept us going as a country is our judiciary. So the constitution is strong, the judiciary are independent still, they are strong, and they're the ones that have kind of made sure that South Africa, that the government toes the line, including the president. So that's been very good. And we have amazing people of all colors, black, white, Indian color, doesn't matter. We have amazing people that are more than capable of doing absolutely brilliant jobs in moving us forward. What the country desperately needs at this point in time is leadership. And if you look around in terms, certainly in world politics, we lack good leadership. We don't have statesmen. People like Madiba was a statesman. He was an absolute statesman. He walked into a room and you had a presence and you had a statesman, and whatever he said and argued for, people listened to. We don't have that. We don't have a statesman leading our country. Great example to go into Australia, there was no leadership. We needed to go back to people to check that it was okay that we could enforce a human right. That's ridiculous. You know, what are we asking people to enforce a human right? It's a human right. So again, you know, I don't think it's just a South African problem. I think it's a global problem in terms of leadership. But I think Cyril Ramaphosa is the right guy. I would be very surprised that someone like Jacob Zuma will see out his period to 2019. And if he doesn't, and Ramaphosa comes in and puts the right people on board, you know, you've got people like Thuli Madonsela, who was a phenomenal public protector, who's an incredible woman and human being, and we need to use those people. We've got them, and there are many of those kinds of people. So South Africa's got amazing talent still, and I still see the hope for South Africa, and I think Gordon and I have no intention of going anywhere. This is our home, this is where we live, and we're staying here. You know, we'll travel a hell of a lot, but this is where we live.
I love that. Have some faith in humanity, in that there are people around in your country, everywhere you are, that are just awesome people, and just get those people into the right places. And it just seems so doable when you frame it like that. So yeah, really, really positive message.
Yeah, I think if you go back in history, I would love for someone to show me where bad has triumphed over good. It hasn't. It's never sustained. You can't, because if you do that, it's the end of the human race. So good always comes out, and that's why there's far more good than there is bad or negative. And I do believe that I mean it's there, and we'll see it coming through in South Africa.
For sure. And I think the other important thing is, like, and you know, you would have seen this through traveling a lot, and Craig and I, as well as living in other countries. Every single country has issues, you know what I mean? Some of them are obviously maybe on a bit of a different level, but there's the same stuff that goes on everywhere. So, and I do, maybe because I guess I'm just closer to it being South African, I do think maybe that South Africans just think that, oh, South Africa, blah, 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 it's not great or whatever. But seriously, the grass is not necessarily greener in a lot of other countries as well.
No, it's not. And you talk to South Africans who've moved overseas. It's tough. My older brother has just moved now to the UK, and they're really having a tough time. And when I saw them in December, my question to them, when they were telling me about this and that and the hardships and where they're living and what they have to do eventually, and I said to them, you have to have no faith in South Africa for you to actually go through all of this.
Yeah.
And I understand their reasons, and I respect their reasons completely. It's not a judgment call. But for me, we will, we believe in the country. I mean, I'm a South African, born and bred, and I believe in the country. I believe in the people, and I love the people. I just don't like certain elements of who we are and what we've become and what we say, and it's important to change that.
Yeah, I think in discussions like this are so important. One of our previous guests, Umbe, also discusses facts of, shame and anger and fear. And if we can just discuss these emotions around those feelings we have of the country and of each other and all that, then once again, it's not such a scary monster anymore, and we can move forward. And I think that's kind of the theme that I'm hearing from you as well, which is really cool.
Yeah, I always often say to my students in history class, you take one of the basic principles of democracy and of the French Revolution with one of the philosophers, I think it was Rousseau, who said, I do not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Mm-hmm. And those are conversations we need to have. And it's not about hate speech or anything. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about opinions, and I'm talking about listening to each other. And those are kind of conversations that heal nations, that get people to understand differences and who we are. And you face homophobia, you talk about it, you discuss, you debate, whatever it is. That's what leads to an understanding. But I need to defend someone's right to say it. Don't have to agree with it.
For sure. And just before we finish off, I guess this is a kind of loaded question. Can we ever expect to see Shaun Fuchs as some sort of political leader or anything like that? Is it and off the back of that, I always think that there's so many, let's say, more normal people that should really be involved in politics and have a say, but kind of never ever do because I guess we all have our own lives and other interests. So is it anything that you've ever perhaps considered? Because from a personal point of view, through who you are and the experiences you've gone through, I would see you as someone sort of that would help a country like South Africa move forward in a much more effective way, as well as a quicker way to become a better version of itself.
The cliche of never saying never is probably quite relevant, but I think for me, I'd rather be a commentator in terms of politics than actually involved in politics. It's a completely different ball game, and but it's if Oprah can do it for 2020, maybe I can do it. I don't know.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, geez, if she can do it, that'll be wow, very interesting. Let's say.
Yeah.
Cool. So I just wanted to just thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's literally been since day one. We kind of I mentioned it to you, saying we'd love to get you on as a guest, and I'm so happy that we have, because first of all, our history together, and our relationship, but then also just for telling your story so openly and so honestly. And there's no doubt going to be so much value in there for so many different humans for so many different reasons. And we look forward to launching this episode this week, and look forward to hearing the feedback on it as well. So thanks for your time, Fuchs, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it, and it's been great, and it's been quite nostalgic talking through the journey and going through kind of the past like that, because we don't do it that often. You do certain segments of it, but not all of it. So I've really enjoyed it, and thank you. I appreciate you both having me on here, and continue doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job. You're providing certainly alternatives to radio, and people being able to clean the house and listen to something different to make those chores a bit easier, and keep on inspiring people, because I think you both do that, and you do it very well. So thank you.
Well, I think just to echo Gareth, I think you've done a lot of inspiring in that talk, and there's lots for people to sit with and ponder over, and as we often mention, a lot of stuff between the lines. So once again, thanks again. We look forward to seeing where you're heading in the future.
And,
Good.
And
Thank
also,
you.
Sorry, one last thing. Like, if people say do want to get in touch with you, is there any way? I mean, do you mind them emailing you or get in touch on social media? Is there any particular preference?
Oh, with pleasure. Instagram is quite easy, and email is also fine at my email address, or maybe on the podcast just put both those.
Cool.
And maybe Facebook on Messenger is also an easy one. So with pleasure.
Awesome. Great. Cool. All right. Thank you, Fudgy. Woo.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, bud.